All right, welcome to the first of a four-part series for the Backyard Farming Small Ruminant series. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Brittany Fletcher. She is our ruminant specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, and I will turn it over to you, Brittany.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Megan, and hello, everyone. If you have any trouble hearing me throughout the session, be sure to put it in the chat and I'll make sure that everything's going well. So tonight, when we begin our first of the four series that we're going to do, we're going to talk about what to expect when they're expecting, leading up to parturition all the way through the first few weeks after your lamb or kids are born. So first off, we use this big word. What exactly is parturition? And simply, it's just the act of processing of giving birth. And so we refer to that as lambing or kidding, and it's the whole act of giving birth. But what exactly is leading up to that act of lambing or kidding? And so we refer to this time as gestation or simply as pregnancy. And for our sheep and goats, this lasts about 5 months. It can last anywhere from 138 days to 159 days, and it averages about 147 days for each species, with give or take here and there. The length of gestation can depend on breed, litter size, so how many they're carrying, their parity, how many times they've given birth before, and sometimes it can even vary between individual animals if all things are else the same. Our sheep are going to have a shorter gestation than our goats. If they are having multiple births, it's going to be shorter than a single birth. And then if it's a lighter offspring, it's going to be less time in the womb than a heavier offspring. Think that it takes a long time to make that baby a lot heavier. And so when we're beginning this process, the most important thing that we need to know going into our lambing and kidding season is simply, when are your girls due? We need to know about when they're going to be born, and we can do this in a couple of different ways. And so we can add marking harnesses to our rams or bucks or paint their briskets so that way when they're mounting, they're able to mark. Not only does this help identify which ram was breeding which ewe or which buck was breeding which doe, but it also lets us know if they have been mounted. Other ways to track of when they're due is to artificially inseminate them. And so you're actually being the one to hand mate them, and you're giving them a specific due date based on specific ovulation times, or an observed mating. And so you're locking them in some sort of pen or pasture of just one or two or three females per male, and you're making sure that that mating is happening on your watch and you're understanding when that ewe or doe is being exposed. We want to keep track of all intentional and even unintentional ram or buck exposures. If a ram or a buck simply decides that he wants to cross the fence today and you have to put him back in, make sure you note that in your records. If you had to remove a buck from a pasture that you didn't necessarily intend for him to be in, so that way you can be aware if in 5 months you're going to expect lambs or kids. And it's a good rule of thumb to always be ready within 142 days after that possible breeding date. This gives you a nice fluctuation on the short side and on the long side to be sure to look out for some of those signs of impending birth. Why do we need to know their due date? Not only is it easier on you, but it's also easier on them. We need to know when it starts so that we can start checking them more frequently. We need to know when to give clostridial vaccinations. This happens between 3 and 6 weeks before birth, and we're doing that so that way there's that passive immunity through the milk of those clostridial vaccinations being given to the offspring. And so you always want to make sure to follow all vaccination labels and make sure that that's happening within 3 to 6 weeks of giving birth. We also want to know if we need to make changes to the feed ration. Do we need to include a coccidiostat to make sure that everything is good on that end? And also, do we need to back off of some feed or increase on some feed if we're having some issues that way too? And we also just want to make sure that we have all facilities and supplies ready, because there's nothing worse than having an unexpected lamb on the ground when complications are definitely present as well. Now, it's also important to understand that there are multiple ways that you can go about having lambs and kids on your farm, and not every situation works for every farmer. There's going to be a different way that works for you that might not work for your neighbor. And some of those ways is putting them into a birthing pen or a jug, a lambing jug, a kidding jug, whatever you want to call it. It's also important to note that these are not always necessary. I lived in Oklahoma for a few years and we were running 60 goats on 120 acres, and we were not assisting them with any births, and we were not assisting them by putting them in any type of pen. They were doing it completely out in the open, but we did have 2 guard dogs per every 20 does, and so they had protection from different predators, and so we didn't feel the need to have birthing pens because they were also giving birth in April to May when the weather was a lot cooler and there wasn't as many we wanted it to keep less intensive as possible. But in these colder areas of the country, or if you're giving birth in earlier in the winter or the spring, we want to make sure that we are having birthing pens or jugs available if we do need them. It's always best to have potentially at least one. So that way, if something does go wrong, if you're birthing on a lamb or on a pasture system, we want to make sure that there's always a space to put them if we need to have them. So a birthing pen is a small pen for females and their offspring, and we can put them in there before birth or after birth. It helps to facilitate bonding, and it makes monitoring our females a lot easier. We only want to keep them in these pens by themselves with their offspring for a few days, and then if we choose so, then move them into a bigger nursery pen with other litters. So that way they've already had their initial bonding with their offspring, and they're not as likely to steal from other mothers if we were to put them in too early. And so typically these lambing jugs are about 4 by 4 feet with ideally 5 by 5 feet. There are varying types of designs. So as you can see in this previous picture, this were made out of metal and they were welded together and they were a little bit more sturdy. But these are simply made out of hog panels. And so there's all different types that you can do. You can buy pre-assembled or you can do DIY. They can be metal, they can be wood, whatever works for you and your budget and for you and your system is what's going to be best. Some good rules of thumb, though, is that they need to be clean. We want them to be well bedded. We want them to be free of drafts, and we definitely want them to be cleaned between litters if possible, because there's a lot of diseases that can go around in that nice, warm, and cozy environment that we want to keep bacteria and pathogens out of. So if you can change out that bedding and disinfect in between, putting different litters in there, that's fantastic. So if you're going to put in your ewes or does into these birthing pens before, it will help keep other ewes or does from stealing each other's babies. It can also help newborns from wandering and mismothering from other does or lambs. It also can prevent outside lambing or kidding if you don't want that to happen. So if you know a big snowstorm is coming up, you can go ahead and put them in if they're due within 5 days. To go ahead and put them into maybe like a larger birthing pen and then move them into a smaller birthing pen when they're ready. That way you're not having to go out into the storm and weather any of that. And it just simply makes it easier to monitor leaving up, especially if you're a first-time producer and you're super anxious about the upcoming season and you might not have a good small ruminant vet in your area. It's always better to be safe than sorry. To put them in a little bit before so that way it can kind of calm your anxiety and calm your animal's anxiety. If you're going to do it after, do it so that way the pens are kept cleaner and drier, so you're not having any of that afterbirth mingling with any of your bedding. And it also helps prevent ewes and does from laying on their babies. Unfortunately, that's one of the common ways with a lot of our livestock that issues can happen when offspring are born is that mothers will lay on their offspring. And so if we're doing this after they are already born, then we are already creating that bond and it's a little bit easier to transition into. But what do you need to be on the lookout for to know when they are actually going to start lambing or kidding? We said to be aware on that 142 day after that introduction of the ram or a buck to be aware. But there are definitely behavioral signs, just like in people, that are going to be very obvious that the animal is coming up on going into parturition. And so some of those behavioral signs are separation and isolation. And so they're going to separate themselves from the herd. They're also going to become more territorial. They will have more interest in other lambs or other ewes or does newborns. They're going to become restless. They're going to become nervous. There's a lot of tail twitching. They're going to be peeing a lot. Pawing at the ground is also a really big sign. They're constantly going to be getting up and down because they're uncomfortable, and they're also going to reduce their appetite. Physically, there's a lot of changes going through that female's body, and so she's going to be bagging up, as we refer to it, and this is simply with her udder filling up. And typically this happens about 10 days out. from actual parturition. And so her teats are going to get engorged. Her vulva is going to get more red and enlarged. She's going to have vaginal discharge. Her belly is going to drop. Her sides will cave in. And then also you will start to see that softening around her tail where her rear end is going to drop a little bit around her hips. And that will be the actual softening of those ligaments around the tail in preparation for her delivering those fetuses. And so now if you're going to take pictures of any slides tonight, these next two slides are going to be the ones that you're going to want to have on your phone and in your back pocket. These are going to be, what do I have in my lambing or my kidding box? We have a short list and a long list. And these have been compiled from all different sorts of lists, looking at every different university of what they've got going on, and different vet practices and what they recommend. And so we definitely want to have some certain things on hand going into our lambing and kidding season, just to simply make that transition a lot easier. So we want to have good bottles and nipples available in case we do have to go into bottle feeding. We want to have colostrum, frozen, fresh colostrum that we have frozen, or we want to have that replacement or that artificial colostrum. We want to have a flashlight in case you are having to have lambs out in the dark and you're not putting them in a lambing pen. A halter in case you do need to tie her up to be able to pull anything. We want to have iodine on hand. And if you don't have iodine or you can't find the 7% iodine, chlorhexidine or betadine is great. We also want to have OB lubricant, OB sleeves, and latex gloves in case you do have to assist. We want to have a prolapse harness or a retainer in case something goes wrong. The most important thing on my mind is always to have record keeping methods. It may seem like it gets overlooked a lot, but it's really important to know what time they were born, if that's important to you, who they were born to, what mother actually went into labor, if you lost any, record weight, record sex, all of those good things to make those records going forward a lot easier. And so if you have someone assisting you, have them keep detailed records of everything that you want to know about your flock or your herd going forward. Cows and rags will be your best friends. And always have the number of a good vet that you trust or a mentor that has gone through several lambing or kidding seasons to be on call for you. And now this is a much more in-depth list, and I won't go into a lot of it. But it simply is just a lot of things to consider. And the more experience that you have with going through different lambing and kidding seasons, the more comfortable you're going to be in deciding what needs to be in your lambing toolkit or your kidding toolkit and what doesn't, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, all of those good things. Facebook groups online are also an excellent source to ask questions and to have those conversations with experienced producers. If no one in your area has any, they can provide you with their own suggestions. And like I said, there is not one perfect way to go through lambing and kidding season. Everyone is going to have their tools and tricks of the trade. And so it's best to have conversations with other people to really figure out what's going to work for you and your family. So getting into what the actual science of parturition looks like. So there's going to be 3 different stages that you or your doe is going to go through. And so her first stage is going to be dilation. So she's going to prep her cervix. So this is that laboring stage where contractions are going to start. Delivery, which is that actual birth of the fetus. And then expulsion. So this is when the placenta and all other fluids are removed from the uterus and it's all cleaned out. So stage 1 is dilation. This can occur from anywhere from 2 to 12 hours, with it typically lasting around 3 to 6. This is where you start to notice a lot of those behavioral signs. The ewe or doe is restless and she'll separate from the herds. She's going to start having contractions. Her cervix is going to start to relax. She's going to have some mucus discharge, some white vaginal discharge. And this fetus is going to position itself into that birthing canal to start getting ready to go. Its stage will end with the appearance of the first water bag hanging out of her vulva. The second stage is where the animal is actually born, so the delivery stage. Typically, this should only last up to 2 hours. It will begin with the rupture of that first water bag, and the uterine contractions will begin to increase. The legs and nose will become visible. The ewe will, or the doe will continue to strain until that lamb or kid is gradually expelled. Additional lambs or kids are usually born within half an hour of each other. And we'll go over some of the things that can go wrong or what to look for and know when to assist here in a second. And so the biggest question that we always get is, what does an actual normal birth should it look like? And for single births and for multiple births, it can look a little different. On the left, we've got the diving position. So both the head and both front feet are first coming out. You'll be able to see the nose and you'll be able to see the front of the top feet. You're not going to be able to see any of the dew claws coming out, and the toes will be pointing down. Another normal position, and not as quite as common, but still normal and doesn't cause as many complications as some of our other abnormal positions, is the hind legs only coming out. And so this is where you're going to be able to see dew claws and the toes will be pointing down. You'll be able to see the underside of the hoof. Both of these are completely normal. And when they're in these positions, they typically do not need any sort of assistance. Everything should go smoothly and the mother should be able to do it completely on their own, which is what we are always wanting. Now, when we're having twins or triplets, the other normal way for them to be born is called front to back. And so one will come out in that diving position with nose and front feet first, and the other one will be kind of like a yin yang situation going on with the back feet coming out first. And so they've been nestled into that uterus very well. They fit well, but they're not intertangled, and they're not causing any issues with the other one being born. Some abnormal positions that are going to happen that you're going to have to assist with and put into a normal position in order to bring them out safely. We've got the elbow lock, and so their legs are not fully extended. They are kind of locked underneath of their chin, and you're going to have to go in and potentially extend those legs all the way forward. Another common one with dystocia is that head being tucked back. And so if you are reaching in, you're able to feel that neck, but you're not able to feel where the head is until you are reaching farther in. And so you'll have to bring that head slowly out to be reaching forward. And then perhaps the most difficult one, and especially if you are a first-time producer, a good time to call the vet is a breech position. And this is when you can feel pretty much just the tail of the fetus. And it's really important that you are able to get help to have experience with this first time, especially because you don't want it to be a traumatic experience for you or traumatic experience for the animal. And so you want to call a vet, call a friend that has lots of sheep and goat experience to come and assist you so that way you can safely deliver those animals. Some other abnormal presentations, you'll have one leg back. This is a much easier one to mitigate, where you can push that animal back in and pull both legs out. Both forelegs will be back, and so this is another one where you're going to have to push that head back in and then finagle those legs both facing forward. And then with our twins, another abnormal one is all four legs of the fronts on both twins are out, and just one head is out with one head tucked back. And so this also requires some finagling. And there's some great videos online of other producers and other universities that have gone through these and simulation models of how to handle some of those lambing and kidding difficulties. And so if you have any stresses going into your lambing or kidding season, be sure to do some of your research so you know what to look for, what to expect. And there's a lot of great resources out there that will go into much more detail than I will tonight. One of the other most important things is, when do you actually assist? Because at the end of the day, we want all of our sheep and goats to have unassisted labors, because that makes it really valuable for them. And that means that their next labor is also going to be easy. We're not going to have to be constantly monitoring them. And it really just proves their true mothering ability. And that's a ewe or a doe that we want to keep in our flock, because she's going to make our job easy by having those natural instincts. The number one rule to follow is if there is no progress within an hour. A lot of people will like to say a half hour as well, just for their own ease of mind. But at maximum, no progress in an hour, you need to get some help to that ewe or doe as possible. During that time, if the dam continues to strain, or if she's given up straining, can sometimes be more detrimental than if she's continuing to strain. We also need to start assisting if there is no appearance of that lamb or kid within that hour. If there's no water bag, or water bag has burst with no progress, that can potentially mean that that second water bag has ruptured, and now that fetus is in the uterus mixing with fluids more so than it should be, and it can be getting into their lungs. If they have a blood-stained rear end and no water bag, we also want to get some assistance there. And if there's a string hanging from the vulva, blood on the rear end, no water bag coming out, want to get some assistance. And then, like I said, any abnormal presentation of the lamb or kid, we want to make sure that we are getting assistance to that lamb because we don't want her to go through any difficult birth. And then we also want to get those lambs and kids out as safely and quickly as possible. So those 3 steps that we want to follow is we want to determine the presentation. Is the head first? Is it backwards or is it sideways? Are they right side up or are they upside down? And then where are the legs in relation to the body? So presentation, position, and posture will really help to make sure you're understanding if you're needing to assist during that 1-hour time frame with no progress. If they're in the dive position, typically that means that you don't necessarily have to assist unless it's getting up to that 1-hour mark, then feel free to assist. Some common mistakes that happen during that time frame of figuring out, do I need to assist? Do I not need to assist? We can allow that dam to labor for too long. So like I said, we want a max 1 hour with no progress. After that, we need to be getting in there and making sure that everything is good. Trying to let that lamb or that ewe or doe deliver her lamb or kid in an abnormal position. We want to correct that position first. And sometimes you just have to correct the position without actually going ahead and pulling them. And so there might not have to be a full intervention. It's simply just getting that into that dive, front feet and nose first for that mother to be able to do it on her own. Another common one is applying too much force. Be gentle and take your time. Just think about if you or someone in your family was in the hospital wanting or having a baby, how would you want to be assisted? Treat your animals how you would want to be treated in that situation, especially if they're a first-time mother. We want to make that process as easy as possible for them, as easy as possible for you. And then at the end of the day, call a vet if you are unsure. It's always better to call than to not call and get into a situation where you're losing a doe, a ewe, or potentially even the offspring as well. So if you are unsure, call a vet. Immediately after birth, that ewe or doe is usually able to care for the newborns themselves. It's always best to have minimal intervention because we want her to kick in those natural instincts. We want to give nature a chance. We don't want to towel dry lambs or kids. We don't want to wipe the membranes from their nose right away. We want to let her get to that lamb or kid as soon as possible. Now, if she is ignoring that lamb or kid, we can move it towards her head. And within 5-10 minutes, if she's not paying attention, then we can go ahead and intervene. But we want to make sure that we're giving her those natural instincts a chance to actually kick in so that she can be the best mother that she can be. And finally, we've got that 3rd stage, which is the expulsion of all of the afterbirth. And so this will take place about 2 to 3 hours following birth. This is when the placenta is actually going to detach from the cotyledons and it's going to be expelled. There are separate afterbirths for each lamb or kid. And so if you're having multiple births, make sure that there are multiple afterbirths following it. Suckling of the lamb is going to stimulate those uterine contractions, which is going to help with the expulsion of that afterbirth. Unfortunately, one of the most common issues that we have with our small ruminants, especially for first-time producers, is a retained placenta. And so anything more than 12 hours and that placenta has not been passed is called a retained placenta, and bacteria and infection can start to set in. And so this is when we want to get a hold of a veterinarian to make sure that they come out and clean her out and make sure everything's good and give her antibiotics if she needs them. Now, there's different views on afterbirth when it comes to our sheep and goats. Their instinct is to eat the afterbirth. A lot of that is because they are a prey animal, so they want to get rid of any evidence of a newborn, so that way there are no predators coming after that scent. But there's been a lot of different researches done. Some of them will go ahead and continue to eat it, but it's highly indigestible for our small ruminants, and it also can carry a lot of diseases. And so it can be a source of scrapies, and it also can be a source of a lot of abortive pathogens that can affect other ewes or does within our flock. And so in the end, it's best to remove that afterbirth, to go ahead and compost it from them, and just make sure that we're upping our plane of nutrition for our moms, so that way that they're in good body condition to continue to supply a lot of good milk to their offspring. And there's a really good rule of thumb that we want to remember when it comes to all of our lambing and kidding seasons. It's the 30-30-30 rule. So after that ewe or doe is starting to push, that baby should be born in 30 minutes or less. That next baby, if she is going to have one, should be out in 30 minutes or less. And they should be up and nursing within 30 minutes or less. If any of those things are not happening, you're going to have to assist. So if baby is not getting up, you're going to have to make sure that she gets latched onto the teat, or you may have to bottle feed. And Megan will go into much more detail about that next week. If one baby is out on the ground in 30 minutes and you think that she's still carrying another one and 30 minutes have passed, you may have to go up and examine to see if she's got another one coming down. And so try to remember that 30-30-30 rule to make sure that everything is good and coming out okay. Now, after our lambs or kids hit the ground, there are some things that we need to do to make sure that they're going to stay healthy and to make sure that they're getting all of the nutrition that they need. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to clip. So sometimes they will have a navel cord that will need to be clipped, and other times they will have one that doesn't need to be clipped. But we do this to make sure that they aren't stepping on it if it is too long. And this can also be an opening for disease-causing bacteria. So we want to make sure that we are going to clip it within about 1.5 to 1 inches within body length. We also want to make sure that we are now dipping that navel cord. And so we want to dip that into a 7% tincture of iodine. However, government regulations have started to make it a little bit more difficult to actually get a hold of the right kind of iodine. And so if you can't get a hold of it, go ahead and use a chlorhexidine solution or betadine. If you're going to use chlorhexidine, go ahead and do it in a 1-to-4 ratio. So 1 part chlorhex, the other 4 parts water. And then a betadine solution will already be diluted to what you need it to be. And you're going to go ahead and dip that navel cord within that solution within 15 minutes of birth. And this is simply to dry out the cord and make sure that it's killing any pathogens and making sure nothing can get up into that umbilical cord to cause any issues. We also want to strip. So this is actually stripping of the mother's teats. And so we want to go ahead and give her a few nice good tugs. You're going to gently pull from the top of that teat all the way down and get those wax plugs that are going to be up in there, and make sure that you've got a nice stream of milk coming out. This helps to make sure that colostrum is ready and available for that offspring to start nursing. And then we want to make sure that they're sipping. So we want to make sure that those lambs or kids are actually getting the first sip of colostrum. And we want to make sure that that's being done as quickly as possible. Now, colostrum is what we like to refer to as yellow gold. It's extremely rich in nutrition and antibodies for our offspring, and they need to be consumed as quickly as possible. The ability to actually absorb the antibodies that are present in colostrum diminishes it with every hour that passes, and there is no absorption after 24 hours. So it's extremely important that within the first 30 minutes to 1 hour, that they are getting a really good drink of colostrum. After 6 hours, it goes down to 75% absorption, 12 hours is 50% absorption, and 24 hours is no absorption. So you really want to make sure that they're getting all of that to make sure they've got the best health possible. They need to ingest about 10% of their body weight in colostrum within the first 24 hours, and they will naturally do that on their own. If you think that any of your lambs are weak or are not appearing to have as much rigor or vibrancy as some of your other lambs, you may need to tube feed them or begin them on a milk replacement in a bottle. Another important thing, especially if you're going to be having your lambing and kidding seasons earlier in the year with the weather that we've got going on all across the country, is extremely important to keep them warm. There's 2 main ways that we can keep them warm. One can be a little bit controversial depending on who you talk to and what kind of experiences they've had with keeping their animal warm. But the first is heat lamps. We only want to do this immediately after birth and until they get dry. It is not necessary if the lambs are dry, well fed, and away from drafts. We don't need to be putting them directly under a heat lamp. And they also need to be used safely. Heat lamps are a major source of barn fires. And so we need to make sure that there is proper wiring and proper plugging in of the heat lamps, that they're a proper distance away from our lambs and away from our ewes, so that way they're not interacting, have the ability to fall. And so we want to make sure that they are safely used. The other way that's becoming more and more common is to have a lamb or a kid coat shown here. Now you can make them your own self, you can buy them. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. But what this does is it keeps that body heat from dissipating any farther than the 1 to 2 inches of space between the lamb coat or the kid coat and the animal. It's a lot safer because they aren't being exposed to something that could potentially end up in a serious situation. But with both scenarios, it's extremely important to not overuse them because we do want to make sure that these animals are able to regulate their own body temperature, especially within that first 24 hours. That's when their body is really going to get used to being outside the womb. It's going to develop all of the necessary defenses that it needs within that first 24 hours. And so after that, kid coats, lamb coats are great to have if you're going to be moving them into a larger pen with other litters. Or if you're going to be moving them outside. But during that first 24 hours, heat lamps are great until they are dry. And then lamb kid coats kind of after that once they figured out how to regulate their own body temperature. Now, once those lambs or kids are on the ground, there's some other common management practices that we need to do or should do or can do just to kind of make our lives easier and to figure out what the future of your flock looks like. And so the first thing is identifying. So we either want to give them an ear tag or a tattoo, however you need to do it for your system works great. It can be just a simple ear tag that's individual to your farm, or it can be a scrapies tag if that's how you're choosing to identify them. But you really want to do this before they leave the jug and kind of have a system going on of like how you can identify who they belong to. A lot of people will either, if your ewe is like 3001, they'll give one lamb 3001A and the next lamb 3001B, meaning that 3001 had twins and this is baby A and this is baby B. But there's no right or wrong system to doing that. It's whatever works for you and your farm. The next most important thing is we want to weigh them. This really helps with our records and also helps with figuring out the genetics of our flock and also making sure that they're growing at an appropriate rate. And we really want to do this the first day that they're born or within 24 to 36 hours after being born. You can use a digital hanging scale. You can actually use a flat scale, whatever you have works for you. When I was a kid and we didn't have all the fancy technology that we do now, we used to have me and my sisters, one of us would get on the scale, weigh ourselves, and then get back on the scale with the lamb and weigh with that and subtract that way. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it, and it's really just for your records and figuring out what's best for your flock. Docking of tails. So hopefully you are not docking any of your goat's tails. We don't really typically practice that here in the US. But docking sheep's tails is also completely up to you. It's really breed dependent. If you are raising hair sheep, there really isn't as much of a necessity to go ahead and dock those tails. But if you are raising a wool sheep or a sheep for show, you're typically going to dock their tails. There's a lot of different and varying opinions and research. I don't think we've necessarily come to a complete conclusion yet of where to dock tails. And so figure out what you are using your sheep for, and then figure out what the typical either cultural norm is or suggested norm is. And we want to go ahead and do that within 1 to 7 days of age. This makes it easier. There's not as much pain. And it just makes it a little bit easier for that tail to fall off a lot quicker because there's not as much blood supply going to it. But we really do not want to wait any later than 6 weeks. At that point, it becomes much more difficult and not necessarily worth it to go ahead and dock that tail beyond that time frame. Castrating, this can be done in both goats or sheep, and this is also dependent on your operation. Um, Typically, if you know you are not going to keep your wether for breeding and you want to go ahead and turn them into a wether, go ahead and castrate whichever method you need. We could spend a whole different series on that of how to castrate, different ways to castrate, but go ahead and do that within the first to 7 days of age. Just like with tail docking, this will help alleviate some of the extra pain that they could be going through. The testes are still really small during that time, so it makes it easier. And we don't want to do this any later than 6 weeks. And so if you are deciding whether or not to keep a buck or a ram for your breeding program, make sure that you are doing that decision within 6 weeks, to really kind of alleviate some of those other issues that come with waiting to castrate. And then disc budding. Once again, this is only for goats. We do not typically do this in sheep. And what this is it's very different from dehorning. And so we're not actually waiting for those horns to develop. We're doing it at the buds. And if you have not done it before, I would recommend having a vet come out and do it with you. And we typically do this within 3 to 7 days of age. And we don't want to do it any later than 2 weeks because those horns are actually starting to attach at that point. They're no longer a bud that's kind of floating above the cranium. It's actually going to start to attach. And so we want to do this within 3 to 7 days of age. There's a lot of benefits of doing it. There's a lot of negatives of doing it. If you're raising goats out in the open and you don't necessarily have the ability to halter break them or have them come in all the time, horns can make a great way to catch. They make it easier to get a hold of that animal. But if you're going to show them, a lot of shows do require that they are dehorned. And so it really just depends on what you are raising your animals for and what your production goals are. And so doing more research into all of those management practices to see what works best for you is a really great tool to have and to know going into lambing and kidding seasons that some of those things do need to be done. I would say at minimum, weighing them. If you are practicing homesteading practices and not going to have as more than 10 sheep or goats, you may not need to ear tag them if you've got very different appearing goats, but you do need to have a scrapies tag. But you might not need another identifier for your farm. And so really figuring out what works best for you, what decisions you need to make or not make is important going up into lambing and kidding season so you can know what to do once they are on the ground. And so I know that's a really brief overview, and potentially in the future, maybe we'll go more in depth on some of those topics through these webinars. But in summary, it's extremely important to know when your lambs and your kids are going to hit the ground. We want to make sure that we are able to take care of our mothers, and we want to make sure that we are able to take care of our lambs and kids. We also need to know what the signs of impending labor are. So are they pawing at the ground? Are they restless? Do they have discharge? Is that water bag actually popping out already? All of those things will make it easier and make that transition of either moving them into a lambing jug or a kidding jug or keeping an eye on them in a pasture setting. We need to know what those normal birth presentations are. So making sure that both feet and the nose are coming out first, or the back feet are with their bottom of their hooves are up. That will make lambing and kidding much easier if you know what to expect. So when something does go wrong, you can know when to start to actually assist. Making sure that you are not waiting longer than an hour with no progress to start assisting. Make sure you have a vet aware that you are potentially going into lambing or kidding season. If you've got a good relationship with your vet, give him a call and say, hey, I've got 10 ewes due within the next 2 weeks. I just want to let you know that if you get a call from me, that's what it's going to be about. That kind of takes a little bit of stress off their plate. And also know that 30-30-30 rule. We want to make sure that they are being born within 30 minutes of each other and that they're getting up within 30 minutes to drink. And then we want to clip, dip, strip, and sip as soon as they hit the ground, making sure that those navel cords are short enough and that they are disinfected. We want to make sure that those teats are stripped of any wax plugs and that that baby is getting the first sip of colostrum as quickly as possible. And then figuring out what common management practices work for you. How are you going to identify them? Are you going to weigh them? Do they need their tails docked? Are you going to castrate or are you going to disc bud? It's really important to feel confident going into your lambing or kidding season. Mother Nature will always know best. And when Mother Nature does not know best, that's when it's time for you to step in. Everything can go extremely smoothly for that lamb or that doe, and especially make sure that you're remaining as calm as possible to make it as easy of a situation as it can be. And with that, I will go ahead and take any questions. Over here on the right side, I've got a QR code for a email list for the University of Maryland Ruminant Livestock newsletter that we will hopefully be starting here in the next few months. Also, a little bit of a plug. We've got, if you're in the Maryland area, we've got a Fundamentals of Sheep workshop coming up at the Frederick Fairgrounds on March 29th. Go ahead and check out the Maryland Extension Small Ruminant page for details on that. It is open to all ages. We will have adult and 4-H'er sessions at the end of the day to kind of give your kiddos a good introduction to full production agriculture all day long. That way they have a little bit more experience and a little bit more of that scientific knowledge, especially if they're wanting to go into college for animal science. They kind of already have some of that more scientific background going into high school, college, whatever they want to do, and have some more hands-on experiences. So if you're interested in that, check that out, and we'll go ahead and figure this out.